Hello, welcome to Non-Dual Christianity. In this video, I want to talk about the difference between viewing death and what comes next through the lens of immortality as compared to resurrection. What I mean by that is, I think many of us, when we think of a victory over death, when we think of heaven, when we think of the next life, we somehow have this idea in our minds that immortality means no death. Immortality means somehow being able to avoid any transition of form, or at least a significant one. Form meaning, this is who I am now, and immortal means this is who I continue to be, without going through death and ending a change of some sort. However, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul very much stresses the fact of Jesus Christ's resurrection. And I would say part of this is because resurrection is very much the pattern of creation. So showing, proving, speaking to the necessity and the reality that Christ not only died but resurrected, came back, gives us then hope, peace, and a lack of fear as we face our own death. What do I mean by that? In this resurrection, we see that there's a cycle, and that this victory over death is achieved not by avoiding death, but by passing through death and realizing that death is not the end. The ending of this form is not the end. It's simply the beginning of the next. Let me read a couple verses here in 50, show you what I mean. Now I say this, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. And then skipping down a little bit, he says, but when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, death swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? Some very beautiful verses, and I'm just kind of picking a couple out of a beautiful passage. But what this means is, to me, it's evidence that the acts of God that we've spoken about in some of the other videos on immanence, non-duality, is that God, the divine nature, gives rise to form, sustains form, and reabsorbs that form before the cycle continues. And then throughout that, there's a concealing and a revealing of its nature to itself. So this death, this moving from perishable to imperishable, is really just moving from form, reabsorbing, and then arising of another form. It's nothing to be feared. But it does mean that death, the victory over death, is not immortality, meaning the avoidance of the transition. Because form itself is not inherently immortal. Form itself has to end. Only the divine nature is self-sustaining, is independent. And I think Paul tips his hand to this when he talks about how flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So form cannot inherit the presence of God because form is given rise to, springs out of the presence of God. So form can't become immortal, self-sustaining, and I think that's what he means by it cannot inherit the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God, the presence of God, is not found within form. It gives rise to form. It's the essence underlying all of creation, giving rise to it. This is hard to accept. So I think part of what Paul's pointing to here is then a kindness toward our ego identities. So for those of us who still are very much identified that this form, who I think I am, my confused state is my real identity, then the death and resurrection of Jesus speaks to that. And I think what it does is it shows that it's not the end of your form. It's not the end of you to pass through death and to come into new life. So whatever your ego thinks it is, something will persist. There's some continuance promised. And therefore, it's not the end of you. It's not the end of your identity in order to go through this death, because there is new life on the other side. So it's a concrete model that proves that what Jesus was saying is true. So what does this mean for us then? Well, if we don't need to fear death, and as part of this, don't play a mind trick on yourself, because I think a lot of Christians would say, oh, I don't fear death. Oh, I might fear the event of death. It could be painful, but I don't fear death. And yet I would say that the obsession with right belief, the obsession with getting into heaven instead of hell, right? The events that we would put after death and the fear that we would feel for those, to me would prove that there's very much a fear of death. My wife was just telling me that perhaps religious people most fear death, which is why they're drawn to religion in the first place. I think there might be some truth to that. So your fear of what could happen after you die, your fear of death, is not necessary. Jesus Christ has proven it's not the end. There is a continuance of form, even as one form ends and a new one is reborn. And from a non-dual standpoint, this makes total sense, because there is a continuance and a permanence of you as the divine nature itself, which never ends. So if we can have this peace and perhaps even hope as we look toward experiencing whatever that reabsorbing unity is, as we look forward to experiencing whatever revelation takes place of our identity, as we look forward to being made alive again with an imperishable body, whatever that means, then we don't need to have fear as we look toward the inevitable. As we draw towards this, as we age, as we get old, as we experience things that are scary in life, we don't need to fear it, because it's just the end before a new beginning. And if we don't need to fear that end, that ultimate end, then I think it also allows us to not fear any endings that we experience in life, whether those are endings of relationships or seasons of life or whatever else. That if we realize part of the fabric of creation, of reality, is this constant cycle of dying and then new life. It's the cycle of resurrection that the Bible talks about. Then truly death is not the end. And therefore, the victory over it is that we no longer need to fear it. Thank you for exploring this with me today.